Okay, the next item of business is consideration of business motion 20818 in the name of Graham Day. On behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau, setting out a timetable for the Stage 3 consideration of the Children, Withdrawal from Religious Education and Amendment of UNCRC Compatibility Duty Scotland Bill. I ask any members who wish to speak against the motion to press the Request to Speak button, and I call on Martin Whitfield to move the motion. I call on Graham Day, sorry, to move the motion.
Moved.
Thank you. That instruction to allow front benches to change didn't extend to yourself, Minister. Anyway, no member is asked to speak against the motion. Therefore, we can move on to the next item of business, which is Stage 3 proceedings for the... Apologies. Nobody's asked to speak against it, but are we all agreed that the motion 20818 be agreed? We are all agreed. Therefore, we move to the next item of business, which is Stage 3 proceedings of the Children Withdrawal from Religious Education and Amendment of UNCRC Compatibility Duty Scotland Bill. In dealing with the amendments, members should have the bill as amended at Stage 2, that is SP Bill 66A, the marshalled list, and groupings of amendments. The division bill will sound and proceedings will be suspended for around 5 minutes for the first division of the Stage 3. The period of voting for the first division will be 30 seconds. Thereafter, I'll allow a voting period of 1 minute for the first division after the debate. Members who wish to speak in the debate on any group of amendments should press the Request to Speak buttons or enter RTS in the chat function as soon as possible after I call the group. Members should now refer to the marshalled list of amendments. And we move to Group 1, Meaning and Character of Religious Education and Observance. I call Amendment 6 in the name of Maggie Chapman. Group with Amendments 21, 11, 22, 22A and 24. Maggie Chapman to move Amendment 6 and speak to other amendments in the group.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I begin this afternoon's Stage 3 proceedings by thanking the Cabinet Secretary and her team for the many conversations we've had about this bill over really quite a very short period of time. I'm very, very grateful. I know we'll come on to some of the areas of disagreement and agreement later on, but I just wanted to put that on record. I'm also very grateful to my committee colleagues and to all those organisations who have contributed so much to both the development of amendments this afternoon, but also overall their views on this bill. Turning to this first group, it is so important that we are absolutely clear in what we mean when giving children and young people the right to withdraw from education and the meaning and character of religious education. As a result of Stage 2 amendments lodged by myself and supported by Parliament, children and young people will have additional rights around withdrawal from religious observance, but not religious education. We should not force children and young people into religious observance, also understood as worship. But it is equally important that they cannot withdraw from religious education, which is a core part of the curriculum. As a society which respects those of all faiths or no faith, or those who are not sure, it's important that children and young people receive education in different faith and non-faith beliefs. It is also important that they receive education to understand the diverse society within which we all live. However, in the bill, the remaining references to religious education use the original 1980 Act terminology of religious instruction, which is an ambiguous phrase and could blur the important distinction between religious education and religious observance. My Amendments 6 and 11 are therefore tidying up exercises to avoid that confusion. Amendment 22 is aimed at facilitating the exercise of those rights. Parents and pupils cannot meaningfully exercise these rights unless they know when religious observance is happening and what form it will take. Therefore, Amendment 22 requires all grant-funded schools, except denominational schools, to inform parents and pupils at least 14 days before about the format and content of any planned religious observance in that school, and any alternative learning provision for pupils who are withdrawn. It also requires an assessment of whether the information conveyed in any planned religious observance in that school is sufficiently objective, critical and pluralistic. Amendment 22A would apply this to denominational schools as well. A court judgment recently ruled that the parental right to withdraw from religious observance is a necessary but insufficient mechanism for protecting parent and children's human rights, and the observance must be objective, critical and pluralistic. So Amendment 22 will help support best practice and ensure all pupils can take part without compromise to their personal beliefs. In cases where elements of an RO activity may not meet the criteria the court specified, that is, asking pupils to pray, worship, sing hymns or affirm their belief in God, parents and pupils will be empowered to act in line with their conscience. Turning to the other amendments in this group, Amendment 21 from Eleanor Whittam is very much in the same vein, requiring ministers to clarify what constitutes religious observance. And I support this, again in the belief that clarity is important. I have a question, though, on Paul O'Kane's Amendment 24. I'm unsure as to the need for his amendment in this Act, and I have a question as to whether it confuses or potentially prevents certain things later on. If we wish to amend the 1980 Act later, how his amendment would interact with that. So I'd be grateful if he could address those points either now or in his
briefly, Paul O'Kane.
I will, of course, refer to much of what Maggie Chapman describes in my own contribution on this section, so I don't intend to detain the Chamber in that regard. But I would just point out to Maggie Chapman at this point, because she's made a number of assertions in her speech thus far, and we referred to this, obviously, in stage 2, there is a clear difference in terms of denominational and non-denominational schools, in particular in terms of what is religious education, what is religious observance. So I can understand where she's coming from, and I said this to her at stage 2 in terms of decoupling RE and RO in a non-denominational setting. But does she understand and does she respect the fact that RE and RO in a denominational setting are intrinsically linked, and therefore some of what she is trying to do will actually be very difficult in a faith school?
I thank Paul O'Kane for his intervention, and I think I disagree. I don't think that RE and RO have to be intrinsically linked, even in a denominational school. They might be, but they might not be.
Very briefly, Paul O'Kane.
I'm very grateful. I mean, tomorrow's Ash Wednesday, so this is a good example. There will be, in Catholic schools across the country, children will learn about Lent. They will learn about that in an academic sense, in terms of what Lent is. They will probably also write down what they're going to do for Lent, and they'll probably write a prayer to help them do that. So that is in an RE class, but it's also RO. So would Maggie Chapman recognise that that is what I'm talking about?
Maggie Chapman.
And I think Paul O'Kane, in his contribution, separated those two things out. Learning about one thing is not the same as practising it. And I think that's what we need to be clear about. That's what young people have told us they want clarity about. And that's what the parents of those young people have told us they want clarity about as well. So my amendments in this group, and I believe Eleanor Whittam's as well, help really be clear at defining what constitutes religious observance, helping us understand as legislators, but also making sure that parents, young people, children and schools themselves are clear too and know how to treat the different elements, and where those lines are, I think, as Paul O'Kane might accept, where those lines might be fuzzy or a little bit blurry. But there is a distinction between observance and education. We wholeheartedly support the role that education plays in any curriculum, but particularly in understanding the diversity of the society within which we live. And I would ask members to support my amendment, which I now move. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Chapman. I now call Eleanor Whittam to speak to Amendment 21 and other amendments in the group. Ms Whittam.
Presiding Officer, I move Amendment 21 in my name, and I will restrict my comments to that amendment. I also declare an interest as a member of Humanist Society Scotland. Amendment 21 would place the duty on the Scottish Ministers to issue statutory guidance setting out the meaning of religious observance for the purposes of the bill. It would also require that the statutory guidance be published within 12 months of commencement of this new guidance provision. This amendment reflects calls for clarity on the meaning of religious observance after stage 2, when religious observance and religious and moral education were separated in the bill, and the parental right to withdraw was limited so as to only apply to religious observance. Amendment 21 also responds to the concerns raised about instances of non-inclusive religious observance in non-denominational settings, most notably by Humanist Society Scotland in their Teaching is Not Preaching report. It therefore requires ministers in preparing the guidance to consider the importance of inclusiveness in both the content and delivery of religious observance. This will support schools in ensuring that all pupils can participate in a way that respects their personal beliefs, supporting a time for reflection approach. Recognising the distinct context of religious observance in denominational schools, the amendment specifically includes representatives of denominational schools as mandatory consultees, alongside operators of schools and those representing the interests of parents, pupils and teachers. This will help ensure that the guidance is workable and appropriate across all school types. The requirement for ministers to publish this guidance within 12 months of the section commencing reflects the importance of the guidance in providing clarity for schools, pupils and parents regarding how the changes in the bill should be implemented. I would therefore encourage members to support Amendment 21. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call Paul O'Kane to speak to Amendment 24 and other amendments in the group. Mr O'Kane.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And at the outset of proceedings today, I add my thanks to all those who have been involved in the process of the bill. Scotland has a long tradition of providing parents and families with the option of denominational education in a setting that they choose, and if they wish to have that. Much of that stems from a long history, over 100 years since the 1918 Education Act, which sought to bring, in particular, Catholic schools into state provision, and it created essentially a fairly unique social contract in Scotland in terms of bringing those schools into the state sector. And I won't rehearse all of the reasons for that this afternoon. Colleagues will be glad to know, but of course it stems from a time where there were certain prejudices about the Catholic community in Scotland, and in particular working class Irish Catholic community in Scotland. So I think it's important at the outset of our debate this afternoon that we recall that heritage and that history and the importance of the place of those schools in our public life. And of course, what followed on from that was denominational schooling in the Episcopalian Church, and of course our Jewish school in Codwood Lodge in East Renfrewshire, which I know very well. So it's fair to say that for at least 100 years there has been a history of denominational education in the state sector. So that is being provided obviously by our local authorities in conjunction with religious bodies. So Amendment 24 in this group seeks to reiterate the Parliament's commitment to that story of faith education, that commitment to denominational schooling in Scotland. And I think also responds to what are serious concerns that have been raised about the direction of travel, or lack perhaps thereof, within this bill. Because the Amendment 24 would put on the face of the bill Parliament's continued support for the role, place and function of denominational schools, most notably, of course, as I said, Catholic schools, which make up the overwhelming majority of denominational school settings. And it would put beyond doubt that any provisions within Part 1 of this bill would not infringe upon or negatively impact upon Section 16 or 21 of the Education Scotland Act 1980 and Section 18 of the 1918 Education Act. Those are the sections of those acts which establish the right to denominational provision, the right to exist, and what powers, functions and responsibilities they have in their operation. So I believe that this amendment responds very clearly to concerns that potential changes from this bill or from other amendments that we are considering across the chamber today would put into question the long-accepted settlement of denominational education in Scotland. And in particular, I would note the concerns that have been raised by the Scottish Catholic Education Service in terms of Amendments 6 and 11, which would change the terminology in statute from religious instruction to religious education. Now, in my intervention on Maggie Chapman, we had a brief exchange on how complicated in many ways this is, and how there is perhaps a wider lack of understanding about how these things operate in practice. So I note the concerns that have been raised that the change of nomenclature would weaken protections that are currently in place, which inherently recognise that interlinked nature of religious observance and religious education in a faith school. And the point that I simply put to Maggie Chapman was those two things are very, very difficult, particularly in a faith school, to separate out the two, because in a religious education class there will be moments within the lesson which will very obviously go into religious observance. So it is not as simple as... Yes, I'll give way to John Mason.
John Mason.
I mean, I take his point that that is what is happening now, that the two are interlinked. But is he arguing that the two have to be interlinked, or they could be separated?
Paul Kane.
Mr Mason makes a fair point in terms of, I am arguing that the two should be interlinked, because the unique ethos of, in particular, a Catholic school, because that's my understanding through my own education, is that the two things are interlinked for a very strong purpose, which is that the ethos of the school is about both your practice of your faith, but also learning about your faith in an academic sense. So I think going down a road that would try and separate out observance from education within a denominational setting, I think would be extremely problematic and hard actually to do in a Catholic school in particular. And I think that's true of the Jewish school, from what I understand of Calderwood Lodge and having been in there. Those two things are very interlinked. And actually it's probably more acute in the primary sector, where children will prepare, for example, for their sacraments in the Catholic Church, where that will be taught in an RE lesson, but will actually involve an element of practice, as he would understand. So I don't think it should be decoupled in that setting, and I think it would be very difficult to do it in practice if that were the road that the government were choosing to go down. I think narrowing RE, the definition of RE in a faith school to interpretation within the academic curriculum extensively, as I say, will lead to perhaps more problems than are being anticipated. Because I do understand more broadly, and I said this at stage 2 to Maggie Chapman, I understand the desire within a non-denominational setting to separate out the two elements, because I understand the academic value of RMPS as opposed to what religious observance looks like in a non-denominational school. But I would just simply say, as I did at stage 2, I don't think you can compare the two settings, because I think they're working in different ways. And it's for those reasons that we won't support the amendments in the name of Maggie Chapman. We have concerns about Amendment 21 in the name of Elena Witham, because whilst guidance and arrow would be welcome, I think some of the text of her amendment would suggest that it might lead to the dilution of ethos and nature within denominational settings, which I've referred to already. I think there would need to be strong assurances that it would not be used as any pretext to constrain or interfere with the ethos of faith schools. And, Presiding Officer, I am conscious of speaking time so early in the debate, but I might just reflect on some of the information that was provided by the Scottish Catholic Education Service, when they said that the inclusion of denominational schools in a state system in Scotland continues to be an example of diverse, pluralistic, democratic education in action, and pointing out that whilst education gives knowledge of your faith, religious observance is a living expression. So I think that again points to the point here that these two things are interlinked within the denominational sector. So it's for those reasons that I would urge members to support Amendment 24, to make a clear statement about the value of faith schools in society, and to affirm our commitment to their long-standing place and their future. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr O'Kane. I've got a couple of brief contributions. First, Stephen Kerr, to be followed by Pauline McNeill.
Presiding Officer, I'd limit my remarks to Amendments 22 and 22A, requiring schools to provide parents and children at least 14 days in advance with detailed information about planned religious observance. That information must not only include the format and content, but the assessment of whether the observance is sufficiently objective, critical and pluralistic. And let me begin by saying this: transparency is not the problem. It is right that parents should understand what's happening in their child's school, and it's right that observance should be inclusive and respectful. I don't think anyone disputes that, but this amendment goes much further than transparency. It introduces into primary legislation a formalised statutory test that misunderstands what religious observance is. Observance is not a classroom lesson in comparative religion. It's not an academic seminar. It may be reflective. It may be devotional. In denominational settings, it is part of the faith character that parents have consciously chosen. To require schools to certify in advance that observance is sufficiently objective, critical and pluralistic is to apply a secular analytical framework to something that is not designed to function in that way. That is not a small drafting point. It is a conceptual mistake. There's also a question of proportionality. We do not require 14-day statutory reports for assemblies, commemorations, themed events or visiting speakers. We do not require advanced legal assessments of whether these events meet an abstract standard. Why then single out religious observance for this level of prescription? Amendment 22A extends this requirement to denominational schools. That raises an even more serious issue. Parents who enrol their children in a denominational school do so in the full knowledge of its ethos. To subject those schools to a statutory objectivity test risks eroding the distinctive character that Parliament has long recognised and protected. There's a difference between accountability and control. There is a difference between guidance and rigid statutory prescription. If further clarity is needed about the meaning of observance, guidance is the proper vehicle. Schools need flexibility. They do not need another layer of bureaucratic reporting embedded in statute. This bill already narrows the parental conscience clause by removing the right to withdraw from religious and moral education. I happen to agree with that. It already introduces a new formal process around observance. In that context, we should be cautious about layering on additional statutory burdens that risk confusion, inconsistency and unnecessary administrative strain. Matters of conscience and faith require careful handling. We should legislate with balance, and that means respecting children's voices, yes, but also respecting parental choice and the integrity of different school types within our system. And for those reasons, while I understand the intention behind them, I cannot support Amendments 22 and 22A.
Thank you. I now call Polly McNeill.
Thank you. I just wanted to make a short contribution in supporting Amendment 24 in the name of Paul O'Kane. Today we are debating the legislation on the right of a child to withdraw from religious education, but it is important in doing so that it does not undermine itself the ethos of denominational schools. Ask any head teacher what is successful about them, and they will tell you that the entire ethos is about the discipline, the character of that school, and without it, they would say it wouldn't be as successful. The 1918 Act is a key piece of law for Catholic education. It's now enshrined in our education system, but it did correct historical inequalities, and it's really important to note that that's one of the things that the 1918 Act does. Now we have a highly successful Catholic education system, part of a modern system that reflects the minority character of the Catholic community, but it gives choice to all parents regardless of their religious background, and I think that's right for a modern Scotland. But what I want to say to the Government, and I haven't yet heard obviously the Government's argument, the Government must recognise that there have been periodic attempts to eradicate or remove Catholic schools from the education system. I have had many letters over 20 years where this has been argued by the Humanist Society and others. Now, everyone has their view, but if the Government, which I don't have any criticism of in relation to this, does think that that is, or recognises that that has happened, then for the avoidance of doubt, the right of the child that we're dealing with today should not undermine in any way that ethos. So I think it's imperative that nothing in this Act does that. I'd like to hear what the Government have to say about this. I don't really see why the Government would be opposed to this amendment. The 1918 is a very relevant piece of legislation, as I've said, but I'd be very interested to hear what the Government have to say. I will be supporting Amendment 24 very strongly for those reasons.
Thank you. I now call the Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, as we have heard this afternoon, Maggie Chapman's Amendments 6 and 11 would replace references to religious instruction with the term religious education in Section 8 of the Education in Scotland Act 1980. Now, I do understand that concerns have been expressed at the use of the word instruction, a point I discussed recently with the Humanist Society. National guidance has long been clear, though, that religious and moral education is expected to cover learning from a range of faiths and worldviews, including beliefs independent of religion, in an objective manner. Now, I also discussed these amendments with the Scottish Catholic Education Service last week, and they expressed concern, as I think we've heard this afternoon, regarding the perceived impact on denominational schools in particular, including on learning out with the classroom. In practice, the term instruction in the 1980 Act has long been understood to mean teaching or education, and it appears throughout the 1980 Act, including in contexts entirely unrelated to religion. Additionally, there are currently 27 uses of the term instruction in the 1980 Act as it would stand after this bill. So these amendments would update only a fraction of these and would leave references to religious instruction in other sections unchanged, including in sections dealing with, for example, the management of denominational schools. And while it might be fair to say that this terminology is somewhat outdated, especially given modern curriculum practice, these amendments risk creating inconsistency and uncertainty in how the legislation should be interpreted. It might create an argument in the 1980 Act, religious education and religious instruction are two substantially different things, which of course is not the case. Now, given the complexity of the 1980 Act, happy to do so.
Graham Simpson.
Thank the Cabinet Secretary for taking the intervention. I genuinely want her help here, because this hinges on what you understand by the word instruction as opposed to what you understand by the word education. Is she arguing that legally the two are the same? Because I genuinely have to decide how I'm voting on this, and you could easily think that the word instruction means religious observance. You could equally think it means education. So just genuinely want some advice, a steer from the Cabinet Secretary.
Cabinet Secretary.
I think to Mr Simpson's point, I accept his question. I recognise some of his concern there. There is dubiety on that point from some of the stakeholders, as I have set out, and for the reasons I've also set out, whereby the term appears in the legislation, the 1980 Act, I think 27 times in its totality. There would be incoherence in amending at this stage, although I recognise some of the concerns that have been brought forward to that end. There is a great degree of complexity contained within the 1980 Act, and the long-standing meaning attached to terminology, which Mr Simpson quite rightly raises, but changes of this nature would really require much more thorough consideration across the 1980 Act to avoid any unintended consequences. So for those reasons, I cannot support Amendments 6 and 11. Now, Amendment 21, in the name of Eleanor Whittam, would require ministers to provide statutory guidance on the meaning of religious observance. I'm very glad that we've worked with Ms Whittam on this amendment, which does respond to concerns which were raised following Stage 2 changes, which separated religious observance and religious and moral education, so that the parental right to withdraw would only apply to religious observance. And as members may know, and I think as we have heard from Mr O'Kane and others this afternoon, in denominational schools there is a close relationship between religious education and religious observance. By providing that duty for ministers to issue guidance on the meaning of religious observance in schools, Amendment 21 ensures that clarity will be provided for schools, for pupils and parents regarding where the right to withdraw continues to apply and where it does not. Amendment 21 requires that ministers consider the importance of inclusiveness in the content and the delivery of religious observance when preparing the statutory national guidance. This will support schools in ensuring that all pupils can participate in religious observance without contravening their personal beliefs. Recognising the particular context of religious observance in denominational schools, Amendment 21 explicitly includes those representing the interests of denominational schools, alongside education authorities and managers of grant-aided schools, as mandatory consultees to ensure that the guidance works for both denominational and non-denominational settings. Finally, Amendment 21 also requires that the guidance is published within 12 months of the section being commenced. This reflects the importance of the guidance in providing that clarity for schools, for parents and for pupils regarding the implementation of the changes, and for those reasons I would invite members to support Amendment 21. Now, Maggie Chapman's Amendment 22 would require non-denominational schools to provide pupils and parents with details of the format and the content of religious observance at least 14 days in advance, as I think we have heard from members today, alongside an assessment of whether religious observance activities are sufficiently objective, critical and pluralistic. Amendment 22A would then apply these requirements to all public and grant-aided schools, rather than only non-denominational schools. Now, schools are already required by the School Handbook regulations to provide information on the form and on the content of religious observance and on the arrangements for withdrawing a pupil. The introduction of a duty to provide an assessment of whether these activities are sufficiently objective, critical and pluralistic would place a significant administrative burden on schools, which I think is the point that Mr Kerr was making earlier. We would expect schools to only provide activities which they already believe to be sufficient in this regard, in line with the existing guidance. The new statutory guidance, though, to accompany the implementation of the bill will highlight the expectation that religious observance is inclusive, as well as what this might look like in practice. In developing that guidance, we will also engage with schools and other interested parties to determine what further support might be appropriate to ensure that religious observance is consistently and sufficiently inclusive of those of all faiths and no faith.
Martin Whitfield.
Grateful for the Cabinet Secretary to take an intervention. She's talking about the guidance. What thought has been had as to what the depth of that guidance would be? Because she and I will both have received guidance in the past that sometimes goes to the nth degree on how something is delivered, where others leave just top-line phrases that on in-service days in particular we perhaps in times past struggled to implement.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, Mr Whitfield and I have fond memories, I'm sure, of the many in-service days that we spent as teachers. But I would draw the members' attention to Amendment 21. I think it is under the requirement in section 5A that ministers must publish the guidance issued under subsection 1 within 12 months. And I think this speaks to the broader point of the requirement for consultation with the mandatory consultees that are also stipulated in the amendment that's being moved by Eleanor Whittam. So I hope that gives him some degree of comfort. But for the reasons I have set out, Presiding Officer, I cannot support Amendments 22 and 22A. I would, however, be happy to consider looking at how the school handbook regulations might be updated alongside the development of the accompanying guidance to ensure that parents and pupils get that important information in relation to religious observance and their associated rights that sit alongside that and can make informed decisions accordingly. Now, Amendment 24, which we've heard commentary from members about this afternoon, Presiding Officer, in the name of Paul O'Kane, provides that the changes made to the Education Scotland Act 1980 by Part 1 of the Bill have no effect on Section 16 or 21 of the 1980 Act or on Section 18 of the Education Scotland Act 1980. Now, Amendment 24 includes reference to a provision which has not been law for over half a century. It may also create a level of confusion by giving the false impression that the modifications do in some way affect these or other unreferenced provisions in legislation, which they do not. However, I do appreciate that this amendment likely aims, as I think we've already heard this afternoon, to give reassurance in response to concerns from the denominational sector that this bill would undermine the existing protections for denominational schools. I just want to again put on the record for Polly McNeill and others assurance that the Government remains unequivocal in our support for denominational schools, and we very much recognise the vital role those schools play in relation to religious observance and religious education within those settings. This will be evident in the position the Government adopts on a number of amendments today to provide that clarity, but it's also evident by my consistent engagement with the Scottish Catholic Education Service throughout the passage of the bill. And I again make mention of the fact that SCES, of course, will be part of that mandatory consultation requirements that are set out in the Amendment 21 that is being moved by Eleanor Whittam. Presiding Officer, in summary, I would encourage members to support. Happy to do so.
Briefly, Paul O'Kane. I'm
very grateful to the Cabinet Secretary for giving way. I mean, notwithstanding the technical point I think she's making about the amendment at 24, she clearly seems to want to accept it in spirit. But I mean, will the Government support it today and put clearly on the record, for avoidance of doubt, that those two pieces of legislation are supported? Because I think this is a very clear moment for the Parliament to do that in our modern context. This is a for avoidance of doubt amendment, which I think is very important.
Cabinet Secretary.
I very much appreciate the sentiment behind the amendment. I have discussed the content of the amendment with the Scottish Catholic Education Service only last week for Mr O'Kane's awareness, and raised some of our concerns about the drafting anomalies that might arise as a result of the way in which the amendment has been put forward. The preference from the Government is that members instead today support Amendment 21, which allows for that guidance to be issued and, of course, puts into statute the requirement for denominational schools, including the Scottish Catholic Education Service, to be consulted as a result of that guidance. And that guidance, of course, at the current time, Presiding Officer, that exists is not statutory in nature, and therefore it will give actually further clarity and protection, arguably, in legislation in a way that is more in keeping. I'm happy to give way to Mr O'Kane again on that point.
I am very grateful. I appreciate your patience, Presiding Officer. But in terms of her support for 21, would she also recognise that the Scottish Catholic Education Service have suggested that proposals that RO should be sufficiently objective, critical, pluralistic, that creates ambiguity potentially around interpretation and potential challenges to the denominational nature of education in Catholic schools?
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm not sure I would go as far as to recognise all of that critique, but I've discussed some of these challenges with SCES directly with Barbara Cooper, of course, in relation to how this will operate within a Catholic school. Mr O'Kane will recall my former employment before I became an MSP was in a Catholic school. I very much recognise that it is inherent to the culture and faith within a Catholic school in relation to the division of RO and RMA. That will need to be undertaken in a sensitive manner, working directly with SCES, which is exactly why they are set out in Eleanor Whittam's amendment as a mandatory consultee. That's the way in which it operates operates at the current time, I should also say, Presiding Officer, in relation to how this is provided for in the guidance nationally. So there's not been a change in that respect. I would encourage members, though, to support Amendment 21, which does allow that guidance to be issued. Happy to give way, Presiding Officer. Very briefly, Pauline McNeill.
I am very grateful, because I didn't understand, Cabinet Secretary, what you meant when you said that the 1918 Act is, I know it's half a century old, but it is still the law. It doesn't really matter how old it is. We have laws that are a lot older than that. The 1918 Act is really important for denominational education. So I just wondered if you could just clarify that isn't the technical problem you've got with the amendment, and you do accept that it is still the law.
Always through the Chair. Cabinet Secretary.
I think the point that I was making, Presiding Officer, and again I have discussed this with Skez, there is an issue here in relation to the drafting. I would have preferred for us to be able to work together on an amendment on this issue. Mr O'Kane and I had met and discussed this point. I understand that was not the case in the end, but there is an issue in relation to creating confusion here between giving the false impression that the modifications in this legislation do in some way affect these or other unreferenced provisions in the legislation, which they do not. So this legislation is not affecting denominational education, I think, in the way the member is suggesting. However, I do appreciate the point that Mr O'Kane has made today in relation to that concern that has been coming forward from the sector, which is why I spent a great deal of time engaging with the Catholic Education Service directly. It's also why, and we will come to this in a later group of amendments, my officials have been engaging directly with SCES on these points and have been out engaging with schools directly in relation to how the statutory guidance will be adopted and will be taken forward, and all of that will be undertaken in conjunction with SCES and with the Catholic Church more broadly, of course, who are stipulated as a mandatory consultee. Presiding Officer, I would ask that members vote against all other amendments in Group 1, as though well-intentioned, as we have heard, they are unnecessary and they are likely to create confusion in our legislation.
Thank you. I call Maggie Chapman to wind up the debate. Press the withdrawal Amendment 6.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. My amendments in this group, Amendments 6 and 11, seek to clarify terminology and help modernise language in the 1980 Act. The term religious instruction is often considered to be the same as religious observance, and my amendments clarify that, replacing the term religious education, helping to avoid that confusion or conflation. Amendment 11 clarifies language around the removal of parental opt-out from RME as a classroom subject, as we agreed at stage 2. To address the Cabinet Secretary's concern about unintended consequences, Amendment 11 only refers to Section 8 of the 1980 Act, but I do appreciate that that may not be enough to sway the Government. Amendment 22 requires non-denominational schools to provide pupils and parents with information about RO, including format and content. This is not a mistake, as Stephen Kerr seems to suggest. It is intentional. This amendment supports the children's rights. Yes.
Stephen Kerr.
Just to be clear, I did not say it was a mistake. I said it was not a technical issue. So I hope that she accepts I did not say it was a mistake.
Maggie Chapman.
I think I did hear the word mistake, but I accept what he said now in intervention. But, however, this amendment supports children's rights under Articles 12 of the UNCRC, the right to be heard, and Article 13, the right to information, by ensuring they have necessary information upon which to make informed and clear decisions. Schools should obviously then ensure the information is in a format accessible to those children and young people and their families. Amendment 22A goes further, clarifying that all public and grant-aided schools should be subject to this duty to provide information. I do appreciate the Cabinet Secretary's comments about the guidance for schools on this, but in committee we heard very clearly that guidance was not always very clear, and when it was clear, it was followed with very, very variable degrees of felicity across the country. But I am grateful for her comments about her preparedness to look at the handbook in the future to see if we can get a little bit more clarity on this. However, with that, Presiding Officer, I will close by pressing Amendment 6.
Thank you, Mr Chapman. The question is that Amendment 6 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed. And there will be a division. And as this is the first division of the Stage 3 amendment stage, I will suspend for around 5 minutes to allow members to access the digital voting system.